Hi, my name is Sander Aerts. I'm the environmental manager for Wessex Archaeology, based in Salisbury. I oversee the environmental work that Wessex does, which relates to taking soil samples and getting them processed and then analysed for all the paleo-environmental remains that may be in them. I'm going to talk today about the study of insect remains, and insect remains may not be something that you immediately think of when you think about archaeology. So how do we find them? Well, they come in buckets typically. You take a sample from a feature, from an archaeological site, and typically it needs to be waterlogged. The water makes sure that the deposits in there are sealed off from any oxygen, and that's how you get the beautiful preservation of these very tiny little remains. They get brought into the laboratory, and then we can use flotation, which basically means allowing all these tiny organic bits to float to the surface. So you apply water, but not just that. You would also add paraffin oil to it. Now, paraffin oil is something that you may recognize from using in your garden to light a torch or something. And what that does is the paraffin will actually attach itself to the tiny little macrofossils of the beetles and the other insects and allow them to float to the top. So if you've done your job correctly, you should end up with a tiny layer of insect remains from hundreds or even thousands of years at the top of the water surface. The things that beetles can tell us about the past environment relates to what people were doing on a site, but it can also relate to how the environment and the climate was changing. Beetles are part of the natural environment, and they will respond to any types of change that you see. And even today, in a time when climate change is daily on the news, you see that the flora and fauna will respond to that in a certain way. Now, by finding all of these tiny little macrofossils and identifying exactly what species they are, you can link those to modern data that we have from these animals, because we know nowadays where they occur. Do they live in warm or in cold climates? Do they like water? Do they like woodland areas? So in order to determine what animals we have in our sample, unfortunately we're not really left with large chunky beetles that are easily recognizable. Beetles are the largest group of animals on the planet, and it's estimated that some 25% of all animal life on Earth is a beetle. So it's very, very difficult to distinguish between different species. Most people think, when they think of a beetle, they think of something quite big and something that you might notice, but most beetles are actually really, really, really small. Therefore, it's very important for us to have a good reference collection to hand. I've got a small example of a reference collection here, and you can see all these tiny little animals which we've mounted onto pieces of paper. And by studying these with a microscope and comparing them to the small fragments that we have in our sample, we can hopefully determine what species of beetle we're looking at. We are using a couple of different elements from the beetles. Not all of the elements that these beetles all the traces they leave behind might be very useful for us. So we look at what we call the dorsal scleroids, which are the armor plates at the top of the beetle. So typically that would include the head, it would include the pronotum or the thorax, sort of the middle part, and then the two hardened bits at the very back of it, the elytra or the shields that cover the wings. So once we've looked at all of our different beetles and we've identified what different species of beetle that we have in the different samples, we can hopefully paint a picture of what the environment looked like. Now, we can go back thousands of years and see how the landscape, the environment and the climate has changed, but we can also search it a lot closer to home. Normal, closer to home archaeological deposit, for example, from the Roman period, the medieval period, which very much shows how people have had a profound impact on the flora and fauna that we see today. Most of the beetles that, for example, are in this case would have been imported by the Romans accidentally by importing cereal grains, for example, therefore telling us quite a lot about how humans have interacted with each other, transported things and have had contact with each other.